The 4th of June 1944, in the Atlantic Ocean, the enemy saved us. I was 19, a machinist's mate on U-505. I expected to die in the water. Propaganda promised us no mercy. Instead, American sailors threw rope lines. They pulled 56 of us from the sea. On their ship, they handed us bread. But this unexpected kindness came with a strange rule. Our survival had to be a secret. Our families were told we were at the bottom of the sea. If your enemy saves your life only to erase your name from the world, is that mercy or something else entirely? Let us know your city and local time in the comments. We want to see how far these hidden stories can reach. If you believe every voice deserves to be heard, please subscribe. On the 4th of June 1944, the Atlantic Ocean became a tomb. U-505, a German submarine hunting off the coast of West Africa, was itself being hunted. For the 59 men inside its steel hull, the world had shrunk to the smell of diesel, sweat, and fear. Above them, the American task group centered on the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal had found its prey. The first depth charges were a brutal surprise. They exploded in the water around the U-boat, not as distant thunder, but as giant fists pounding on the metal shell. The lights flickered and died, plunging the control room into emergency red. Gauges shattered, pipes burst, and a fine, cold mist of seawater sprayed through the cramped compartments. The submarine lurched violently, tossing men from their feet. Another explosion, closer this time, slammed the boat sideways and sent it into an uncontrolled dive. Water poured in through a rupture in the outer hull, and the air grew thick with the choking stench of smoke and burning oil. Among the crew was a 19-year-old machinist's mate named Carl Weber. He was steady with machines, but the sounds the U-boat was making were sounds of death. The groaning of stressed metal was a language every submariner understood. He and the other engineers fought to contain the damage, but the boat was mortally wounded. The rudders were jammed. The engines were failing. They were trapped. On the bridge, Captain Harold Lang, a veteran officer who had been injured in a previous attack, knew his options had vanished. His U-boat was sinking, out of control, and his crew would drown with it if he hesitated. The order, when it came, cut through the chaos with a terrible finality. "Abandon ship! Scuttle the boat!" It was the last command he could give, a command to save his men while ensuring their vessel would never fall into enemy hands. For the sailors of the German Kriegsmarine, this order was an admission of defeat, but it was also a signal. It meant the fight was over, and another, more personal terror was about to begin. Carl scrambled barefoot across the tilting, oil-slick deck plating. He felt the cold pressure of the deep sea pushing against the hull, waiting to claim them all. The propaganda had been clear, drilled into them for years. Surrender was dishonor. Capture was a fate worse than death. American sailors, they were told, never took U-boat men alive. They were seen as pirates, murderers of merchant sailors, and were to be shown no mercy. The stories were vivid. German submariners shot in the water, their life vests riddled with bullets as they tried to surrender. Carl braced himself for that moment. As he clambered up the ladder and through the hatch, the bright, blinding sun of the Atlantic hit him. He saw the American warships circling, their guns pointed directly at the foundering submarine. He and his crewmates began to jump into the waves, into the oily water filled with debris. They were exposed, helpless, floating targets. He waited for the crack of rifles, the sting of machine gun fire that would end it all. But the gunfire never came. Instead, something impossible happened. From the deck of the nearest American destroyer, sailors were tossing rope lines into the water. Men were pointing, not with guns, but with their hands, directing the soaked and terrified Germans toward the ropes. A small boat was being lowered, its crew ready to pull men from the sea. Carl watched, treading water in disbelief, as one of his shipmates was hauled over the side of the American ship. No shots, no blows, just strong hands pulling him to safety. The first sight was not of an enemy, but of a rescuer. One by one, they were plucked from the Atlantic, coughing up salt water and oil, exhausted and shocked. On the steel deck of the USS Pillsbury, a petty officer looked around at his fellow survivors, at the Americans moving among them. His voice was a low whisper of disbelief. They were being treated like shipwrecked men, not like enemies. This was not how the war was supposed to work. This mercy was a language they did not understand. Everything they had been taught, every warning from their commanders, every promise of enemy cruelty, was proving to be a lie. As the 56 survivors were gathered, their initial fear began to curdle into a profound and unsettling confusion. They were prisoners, yes, but they were also alive. They had been spared. The first crack had appeared in the iron wall of their beliefs. If this part was a lie, if the Americans treated them with a strange, unexpected decency, then what else had they been told that wasn't true? Their world, which moments before had been a sinking submarine, was now something far more unstable, an idea of a world that had just been proven wrong. In that moment of rescue, surrounded by the very men they had been trained to kill, death felt certain. Life, however, now felt like a mystery. Aboard the USS Guadalcanal, the 56 German survivors stood shivering, not just from the cold Atlantic but from a deep, rattling shock. Their wet uniforms clung to them like a second skin, smelling of seawater and diesel fuel. They were stripped of their weapons, a process done with an efficiency that felt almost routine, not with the angry humiliation they had been conditioned to expect. For men who had spent years learning that their enemies were monsters, the simple humanity of the American sailors was profoundly disorienting. Instead of insults and blows, there were quiet gestures of care. Medics moved among them, applying bandages to burns and cuts with gentle hands. Dry blankets were draped over their shoulders. Someone brought mugs of hot, black coffee, and the steam rising from the cups seemed to rise against a wall of disbelief. Then came bread. It was just plain, simple bread, but to men who had been living on meager rations in the belly of a submarine, it was a feast. It was life. The architect of this unexpected mercy was the American commander, Captain Daniel V. Gallery. He was a bold and imaginative officer, and as he watched the U-boat survivors come aboard, he was not just seeing defeated enemies, he saw an opportunity. The standard procedure was to sink a crippled U-boat to ensure it never threatened Allied shipping again. But U-505 had not sunk. Gallery's boarding party had managed to stop the flooding and secure the submarine. It was a prize of immense value, a floating treasure chest of intelligence. Inside were codebooks, charts, and most importantly, a fully operational Enigma machine. Gallery made a decision that broke with all precedent. He would not sink U-505. He would tow it home. This tactical gamble, however, required his crew to treat their new prisoners with a calculated fairness. The German sailors were now more than just captives. They were living proof of a secret that must be protected. For the Germans, this careful treatment felt like a reprieve, but it did not erase their suspicion. Kindness now, cruelty later. Was this just a way to soften them up before the brutal interrogations began? 19-year-old Carl Weber watched an American sailor offer a cigarette to his captain, Harold Lange. He saw the flicker of exhausted surprise in Lange's eyes. They had been trained for a glorious death at sea, for loyalty to the last breath. The Kriegsmarine propaganda system had been relentless, a faceless voice that whispered in every sailor's ear that surrender was the ultimate shame. Allied posters promised no mercy for U-boat crews, and German orders encouraged suicide over capture. The numbers backed up this grim reality. By 1944, of the more than 35,000 German submariners who had gone to sea, nearly 28,000 would never return home. It was a death rate of almost 80%. They were expected to die. Survival was not part of the plan. And yet, here they were, surviving. The official rules of war, dictated by the 1929 Geneva Convention, stated that prisoners of war must be treated humanely, given food equal to that of their captors' troops, and housed without cruelty. But the U-boat men had been told those rules did not apply to them. They were considered outside the laws of war. This bread, this coffee, this quiet dignity was a direct contradiction to everything they knew. One sailor, scribbling his thoughts later, would try to capture the feeling. "We thought we were dead men," he wrote. "Instead, they gave us bread. I tasted it like a man tasting life for the very first time." As they stood on the deck of the USS Guadalcanal, the setting sun painting the Atlantic sky, they were men caught between two worlds. They had escaped the watery grave they had expected, but they had entered a new, unknown territory. They were prisoners of an enemy who followed rules they had been told were a myth. For Carl and the others, a terrible question began to form in the silence of their minds. What was worse? The quick, honorable death they had been prepared for, or this strange, disarming captivity that preserved their lives but might cost them everything else? The mercy shown to the crew of U-505 had a price, and that price was silence. After their initial processing aboard the USS Guadalcanal, the 56 survivors were not sent to a standard prisoner of war camp. Instead, they were transferred under a cloak of absolute secrecy to a small, isolated camp in Bermuda. Here, they were not just prisoners. they became ghosts. The reason for this extraordinary measure was the U-boat they had left behind. Captain Gallery's prize was a tactical goldmine. The captured Enigma machine, along with its associated codebooks and charts, provided Allied intelligence with a direct window into the secret communications of the German Navy. Analysts at Bletchley Park, the nerve center of British code-breaking, could now read U-boat signals almost as quickly as the Germans themselves. Naval intelligence experts would later say that the capture of U-505 saved thousands of tons of Allied shipping and played a significant role in shortening the war in the Atlantic. But for this intelligence to be useful, the German High Command could never know that U-505 had been captured intact. If they suspected its codes were compromised, they would change them immediately, and the advantage would be lost. And so, an elaborate deception was put into place. Officially, U-505 was recorded as sunk by Allied action. Its entire crew was listed as killed in action. For the men in the Bermuda camp, this meant they had to disappear from the world. They were cut off from everything and everyone they had ever known. Their existence was hidden, even from the International Red Cross, the very organization meant to protect the rights of prisoners. There would be no letters home, no messages to reassure their families that they were alive. In Germany, mothers, wives, and children would receive the dreaded official notice, lost at sea. They would mourn sons, husbands, and fathers who were, in fact, very much alive, living out their days behind a fence on a quiet island, thousands of miles away. For the young machinist's mate, Carl Weber, and his crewmates, this isolation was a new kind of imprisonment. The physical conditions were not harsh. They were given adequate food and shelter, far from the horrors of the front lines, but the silence was a heavy, crushing weight. They had survived the war, only to be erased from it. They existed outside the rules they had just begun to trust. The Geneva Convention, that had guaranteed their humane treatment, also guaranteed their right to communicate with their families. That right was now denied. They were living phantoms, caught in a limbo, created by their enemies' kindness. The mercy that had saved their lives had also stolen their identities. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The war in Europe raged on, and they heard only snippets of news, disconnected from the reality of the fighting. They were safe, but they were no one. In May of 1945, the war in Europe finally ended. For the men of U-505, it should have been a moment of release. But their strange captivity continued. It was not until the conflict was over that the American government could finally acknowledge their existence. When they were eventually returned to a shattered, post-war Germany, they did not come home as rescued sons. They arrived as strangers, ghosts returning from a watery grave. The homecoming they had dreamed of during their long silence turned into another kind of ordeal. Their families had already mourned them, held funerals for them, and tried to move on. Their reappearance was a shock, a miracle tinged with confusion and suspicion. Neighbors whispered. How had they survived when so many others had died? The shadow of dishonor that propaganda had warned them about had followed them home. One former prisoner recalled the bitterness of that time. You surrendered, people would say, their voices a mix of curiosity and accusation. Why didn't you die with your boat? The shame of capture, which they had been spared on the deck of the American warship, found them years later in their own hometowns. A deep and painful doubt took hold. Was the mercy they had been shown on that June day, in 1944, truly mercy? Or was it just a different, slower kind of loss? In the years that followed the war, the men who had shaped the fate of U-505 looked back on that day in the Atlantic from very different shores. For Captain Daniel V. Gallery, the American officer who had made the audacious decision to capture the submarine, the event was more than a mere tactical victory. He would later write that saving U-505 was a moral triumph as well. In a war defined by staggering brutality, his crew had chosen a different path. They had proven that it was possible to defeat an enemy without succumbing to the hatred that fueled the conflict. We showed the world it could be done, he reflected, seeing the capture not as an act of aggression, but as an act of restraint. It was a demonstration that even in the heat of battle, the rules of civilized conduct could hold. For him, the bread and coffee offered on his ship's deck were not just gestures of kindness, they were affirmations of a principle larger than war itself. For the German survivors, however, the memory was far more complicated. The mercy they received was forever entangled with the long silence that followed. Some carried a quiet gratitude for the rest of their lives. forever thankful for the American sailors who pulled them from the sea. They had been given a second chance at life, a chance to see their families again, to build new lives in a country recovering from its own ruin. But for others, the years of secrecy left a permanent scar. The shame of surrender, amplified by the whispers of their neighbors, became a bitter companion. They had been saved, yes, but they had also been used. Their existence had been a tool of war, their names erased for a strategic advantage they could not comprehend at the time. The mercy felt conditional, a kindness with a hidden cost that they would continue to pay long after the fighting had stopped. The echoes of that silence were felt most acutely by the women who had waited at home. In Hamburg, a widow recalled the day the official telegram arrived. It informed her that her husband's submarine had been lost with all hands in the Atlantic. For years, she mourned him. She lit a candle for his memory on his birthday and told their young son stories of his father's bravery. Then, nearly a decade after the war had ended, she received a letter. It was from him. He was alive. He had been a prisoner, a ghost in a secret camp. The news was a tidal wave of emotion, a flood of joy and relief, so powerful it almost broke her. But mixed with the joy was a profound sense of sorrow. "I wept for joy that he was alive," she later said, "but I also wept for the lie of those years. The mercy that had spared her husband had also robbed her of a decade of truth, leaving a wound that never fully healed." Today, U-505 does not rest at the bottom of the Atlantic. It sits in quiet dignity as the centerpiece of an exhibit at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. Thousands of visitors walk its decks each year, peering into the cramped quarters where 59 men once lived and worked. They touch the cold, steel hull and marvel at the complex machinery of the Enigma. Most are unaware of the extraordinary human story that unfolded around this vessel. The story of the 56 men who prepared to die there, and the American sailors who chose to save them instead. The submarine is no longer a weapon of war, but a silent monument to a moment when humanity briefly triumphed over hatred. In that moment of capture in June 1944, when the taste of bread and coffee replaced the expected finality of bullets, something larger than the war had surfaced. The U-boat men expected death. Instead, they were given life. In the middle of an ocean of cruelty, an act of mercy slipped through the waves and refused to sink.